To reintroduce myself, my name is Sam George. Like some of the other speakers here, I've been surfing, most of my life. I started in Hawaii. My family moved there in the late 1960s, and I started in Hawaii, then eventually moved to California. And like a lot of you out there and a lot of the other speakers here, surfing kind of eventually consumed my life. I didn't really want to ever do anything else. I had a sort of a truncated academic career. After a couple years at university, the dean of students called me to the office and sort of advised me to leave school, step aside, make room for someone that really wanted to go to school instead of somebody that was just taking up space. So I got on my skateboard and I rode away, and I went to work at a surf shop, and I sort of never looked back. So I've after that period, I worked at surf shops. I eventually started competing as an amateur, pretended to be a pro surfer, competed on the pro tour for a little bit, and then started writing for the surf magazines. About 1982, I started writing for surf magazines, and that was sort of my so-called career. From that point, I worked at the surf magazines, both Surfing and Surfer in the United States, which were the two primary surf magazines, and I worked there and contributed to the media there from about 1982 to about 2005, where at that point I was the editor-in-chief of Surfer magazine. And then I sort of stepped away from that role and sort of segued into the role of making documentary films, mostly about surfing and surf-related issues. Later this afternoon, two of those documentaries are going to be screening at the terminal. So you'll get a chance, if anyone's interested, you'll get a chance to see what I've been up to in the documentary films department. But today, what I'm going to talk about is what I call surfing today, a radical perspective. And it puts a lot of what some of the other speakers that have been talking today, it sort of is giving a little bit of a historical perspective on supporting a lot of the things that they spoke about. So that's what I'm going to be, that's sort of what I'm focused on. And I think that here's the best thing. Porto, looking out across you people and looking out at that lineup and looking out at everything that's going on the beach there and in the water, this is the perfect place for me to give this talk. It couldn't be better. And ever since I got here, it's the first time I've ever been to Porto, I was so encouraged because I had no idea that this was going to be the perfect place to give this talk. So, earlier in the month, an Instagram video went viral. The video was showing New York socialite Ivanka Trump surfing at Kelly Slater's wave pool, being taught by legendary Polynesian surfer Raimana van Bastelaar. The comments on Ivanka's Instagram site were rapturous. The best one came from Kim Kardashian. All she said was, "Wow, you go, girl," okay? But on the surfing websites, the comments were almost uniform, and they all sort of had one single theme. That image represents the death of surf culture. That surf culture is dead. An artificial pool next to a goat farm in Central California farmlands that costs $65,000 a day to rent, which works out for the people that can afford that to about $400 a wave, $380, $400 a wave, being surfed by a billionaire socialite from New York City, being taught by a legendary Polynesian surfer. And so the general feeling is that this is the last straw. This image here, it went viral, millions of views. Surf culture is dead. But the interesting thing was, leading up to this, sort of just anecdotally in my own life, my own surfing life, and also I'm still very involved in the surf media, such as it is, reading a lot of comments about what a lot of especially younger surfers are saying, and then a lot of surfers my age, of all ages actually. There's this sort of collective feeling that surf culture has somehow been degraded, that surf culture is somehow in decline. And they point to a lot of different reasons. And Nick listed a number of them that people like to blame things on. You know, the surf media, pro surfing, competitive surfing. You know, somehow that's longboards. You know, oh, that was it. There went surf culture. You know, leading up into, of course, COVID and that boom that Nick so, beautifully articulated. People are constantly saying that they feel that surf culture has been dying. Surf culture is no longer authentic. And thanks to Ivanka Trump, now it's dead. But I don't believe that's true. I think that's what really has happened and what we're really experiencing today is that surf culture is not in decline. It's taken what I call a radical turn. And when I say radical, I'm not talking about a tail-high, full rotation aerial. I'm looking at the word radical and breaking it down to one of the roots of that word, which is radial. Radial can be defined by a line drawn continuously to its point of origin, or in other words, a circle. I think what's happening today, and has been happening for at least the last 30 years, is that surfing has taken a radical turn, and it's not only not degrading, but it's returning to its origins. So when you talk about the origins of surfing, and believe me, I've been doing this for 45 years talking about it. People point to things like the Peruvians were riding their bundled reed boats in through the surf, the fishermen. The Vikings, they designed their ships, they were called Nors. They were designing their ships to ride in and out of the surf so that, when they were, pillaging along the coast, they could come right onto a beach. But what I sort of am going to describe as surfing is recreational surfing, which is completely different than washing ashore on a log, okay? So I'm talking about recreational surfing. One of the films that we'll be showing later this afternoon addresses the issue of the origins of recreational surfing on the coast of West Africa, where if you look at sort of the diaspora of the human species, it existed there long before Polynesia. But for our purposes here, I want to talk about where surfing developed and evolved from basically child's play in the surf to a sophisticated pastime. And where that took place was in the Hawaiian Islands. So they estimate that when the first voyagers, those intrepid voyagers in their voyaging canoes, when they sailed from the Marquesas, then to Tahiti, and traversed the entire Pacific and landed in Hawaii, they estimate that happened sometime between 1100 and 1200 AD. That was when they first got to what now we call the Big Island of Hawaii. Over a couple more centuries, they moved throughout the archipelago, eventually reaching Oahu and finally Kauai in the Hawaiian archipelago. But when you think about what that means, those Marquesans, when they got to Tahiti, they brought surfing with them. They brought recreational surfing with them. When those voyagers made it to Hawaii, they brought it with them. So that means that people have been recreational surfing in the Hawaiian Islands, let's just say 1200 AD. So we'll take it that far back. By the time the first Europeans landed in the late 19th century, or actually late 18th century, let's say 1778, 79, that means that surfing had been developing and evolving into a very sophisticated pastime for at least 3 centuries, 300 years. They worked on surfing. By the time the Hawaiian colonists got to Oahu and found the promised land, the fertile crescent of surfing, which is Waikiki. By the time they found Waikiki, surfing was a very sophisticated activity. They had designed very sophisticated surf craft, not just the Paipo belly boards or the Alaia boards, the shorter, lighter ones, but the Olo boards that they would ride on those big combers that would break, 300 yards out offshore. Those boards were very sophisticated hydrodynamic machines. And they the whole aspect of surfing was developed in a way that most people, they look back at these old photos and they go, oh, look how crude they were. Look how crude it must have been. No, they had specialists. A lot of people think the word kahuna means like witch doctor. No, in Hawaiian, it means expert. They had kahunas that all they did was design surfboards. That was their specialty. They had kahunas that studied the conditions. Basically, they were the surf line of their day. They would study the conditions, study the birds, the currents, the swells, all of it, to try to hopefully predict good surfing conditions. They even found a heiau, which is sort of like like an altar, you could call it, but in some cases it was like a site where knowledge was expressed on the sort of face of what now is called Diamond Head, that they studied surf forecasting, and when the swell would come up, because you got to remember back then there was no town of Waikiki. There were no hotels, there were no buildings. There were taro fields. The community there lived in Honolulu to the west. When the swell would come up, they would put kites up to signal to the people in Honolulu, hey, the waves are up. And people would come surfing. So they even had surf forecasting back then. All of this had happened by the time that the first Europeans got there. So you can imagine how amazed these first, explorers, colonists, you could call them, and then later the missionaries that came. You can imagine how amazed they were at this site, that these weren't just kids splashing around in the shore break. This was a sophisticated activity. This book was called by Reverend William Ellis, and it's called Polynesian Researches. It was published, this is the first edition, it was published in 1833. This on the front piece, that is the very first illustration of surfing ever made. That's the first picture that anyone ever got of surfing. And the descriptions that these first Europeans that arrived in Hawaii, they were really fascinated by this sport. And they really took a close look at it. And so when you read some of these descriptions, we can all you can just relate to them. And afterwards, if anyone wants to come up and actually hold a little bit of surfing history, I'd please come up afterwards. But I'll tell you a real quick just anecdote. I was giving a talk at an event in California, and I had a book. I have an earlier book than this. It's a version of Cook's Voyages from 1813, and I was doing a similar talk like this. And I put it down on a table before I was going out to speak, and one of the young guys that was doing the audio-visual, he didn't see me do that, and he came over and he put his beer down on the book. And I looked at him and I said, that book? I was published in 1813. And he goes, oh my God, and he pulled his beer away, and there was a big circle on the book. And he was horrified. But I said, no, you don't understand. I go, see that nick? See this scratch? See that tear? That happened over 150 years of this book's existence. That beer ring now, it's part of its history. So if you want to come up and put your handprints on this, feel free. But for example, let me get my, I know. This shows you how long I've been surfing. Imagine arriving, on a sailing ship to these islands and coming across your first glimpse of surfing. And in this, William Ellis wrote, one of their favorite sports, they called it at the time fahi'e for some reason, is swimming in the surf when the waves are high and the billows break in foam and spray among the reefs. Individuals, and this is the important part, individuals of all ranks and ages and both sexes follow this pastime with great avidity. I have often seen along the border of the reef from 50 to 100 persons, all ages, sporting like so many porpoises in the surf, sometimes mounted on the top of the wave and almost enveloped in spray, at other times plunging beneath the mass of water that is swept in mountains over them, cheering and animating each other, and by the noise and shouting they made, rendering the roaring of the sea and the dashing of the surf comparatively imperceptible. The most wonderful thing about that passage is they could be describing what's going on right over there. In another one of these early descriptions of surfing. And this was from another reverend, because it's the missionaries. They first, of course, they were really in Hawaii. First it was the whalers, then it was the explorers, then it was the missionaries. And this is from Life in the Sandwich Islands by Reverend Henry T. Cheever. And this was the first edition from 1851. And a lot of people, there's like this general perception that the missionaries got to Hawaii and forced everyone to stop surfing. That's actually not true. And I'll explain that in just a couple minutes. Really, a lot of these New England missionaries, they were fascinated with surfing. They were almost envious, because you got to remember, swimming in the sea was not done in developed countries at the time. But this passage from Henry Cheever, I just love this one. And again, you guys are welcome to come up and take a look at this. So he writes, and this is written on a visit to Lahaina. He goes, "It is highly amusing to a stranger to go out into the south part of his town someday when the sea is rolling and heavily over the reef, and to observe there the evolutions and rapid career of a company of surf players." The word surfer didn't exist back then, but what a wonderful description, surf players. The sport is so attractive and full of wild excitement to Hawaiians, and withal so healthful, that I cannot hope, but it will be many years before civilization shall look it out of countenance, or make it disreputable to indulge in this manly, though it be dangerous, exercise. Many a man from abroad has witnessed this exhilarating play, has no doubt wished that he were free and able to share it himself. I should like nothing better if I could do it than to get balanced on a board just before a great rushing wave, and be so hurried in half or quarter of a mile landward with the speed of a racehorse, all the time enveloped in foam and spray, but without letting the roller break and tumble over my head. Both men and women, once again, both men and women, girls and boys, have their time for this diversion. Even the huge premier, or the royal queen, Ahuhea, has been known to commit her bulky person to a surfboard. And the chiefs generally, when visit Lahaina, take a turn or two at this invigorating sport with the billows and board. For a more accurate idea than can possibly be conveyed by any description, the reader is referred to the engraving. And like I said, I'll encourage you guys to come up, because here is, and I'll show it to you in person, that is the second image ever produced of surfing. So basically, that picture there and this picture here, that's the birth of the surf media that we have worked at for so long. I'll read a third one that has sort of helps this narrative move along. This is from another Protestant missionary from New England named Nathaniel Emerson, who visited there. Now, this was in 1892, so this is 40, 50 years later. And of note is, in the town of Haleiwa, if any of you have ever been to Hawaii and surfed in Haleiwa, off the road there, right before you get to the bridge, is the original site of the church that Nathaniel Emerson founded when he first got to Hawaii. But he wrote, "The sport of surf riding possessed a grand fascination, and for a time it seemed as if it had a vitality of its own national pastime." Once again, here's the important part. "There are those living who remember the time when almost an entire population of a village would at certain hours resort to the seaside to indulge in this magnificent accomplishment." But then by 1892, he went on to say, "We cannot help but mourn its decline, but this too has felt the touch of civilization, and today it is hard to find a surfboard outside our museums and private collections." So that was 1892. A lot had happened between, the first, those very sort of almost rhapsodic descriptions of surfing and 1892. Like I said, sort of common sort of thoughts about surf history have been, the missionaries came there and they shut it all down. You weren't allowed to surf. That wasn't exactly true. Two things happened. One was that, especially when the islands were united under one leader, that leader eventually gave up the old ways and the old beliefs, and they adopted Christianity. And what's interesting is one of the most fascinating figures in the world was a young woman named Kahumanu. Kahumanu was actually King Kamehameha's favorite wife, and she eventually became Queen Regent of Hawaii. But she actually was a renowned surfer in her youth. She was and there's actually, if you look at the old legends, there's a surf spot named after her off the mouth of what now we know as Pearl Harbor. But Kahumanu eventually became Queen Regent, and in the late 1800s, she adopted Christianity. And what that did was introduced into the culture, not necessarily that you have to stop surfing, but you have to wear clothes while you're surfing. Because they thought that the sexes commingling essentially in the nude, of course, led to, you can imagine what that would lead to. Matter of fact, a anthropologist named Ben Finney, who wrote really one of the first anthropological books about the history of surfing in Hawaii, his theory was that surfing really started to die out when it stopped being a sexual prelude. Because he was saying that back then, apparently, if a man and woman rode a wave together, it sort of indicated that something that sort of togetherness might happen a little bit more involved when they got to shore. So basically, when they sort of introduced more modesty, that's when surfing started to decline, because guys thought, well, what's the point? If I can't surf and show off in front of girls, why do it? Also, a lot of women, they started dressing more modestly, and that didn't lend itself to, any sort of aquatic activity. The second thing, of course, which isn't quite as lighthearted, was how the Hawaiian culture was decimated by foreign disease. They estimated, like from 1850 to the late 1890s, 80% of the Hawaiian population had died of measles, typhus, tuberculosis, syphilis. I mean, the massive die-off of the Hawaiian people. So that by the late 19th century, late 1890s, there weren't that many people left to surf, and most of the people that did surf were guys. This is sort of of course, an easily recognizable early depiction of what surfing looked like from about 1900 for a couple decades. It was done primarily, they surfed in other places, but Waikiki was so perfectly suited for what we can call conventional surfing, which really isn't, but stand-up board riding. Waikiki on Oahu was the Fertile Crescent. And this is where most of this surfing took place. Now, a lot of people, they look back and they just think, oh, what a wonderful innocent time, and how fascinating that must have been, in sort of an innocent time back then, with everyone surfing like this. The truth of the matter was that surfing by the 1906 to 1910 was already commercialized. It was already being commercialized. And one of the people responsible for some of that, I don't know if you can see, is this man right here. That's actually the only photo that exists of the famous American author Jack London learning how to surf. And he wrote a very popular story in a magazine at the time called Women's Home Journal called A Royal Sport. And it was all about him trying to learn how to surf in Hawaii. And it fascinated the world when they saw it. At the same time, a newspaper writer and a promoter named Alexander Hume Ford moved to Hawaii, looked at what was going on in Waikiki and said, this is such a wonderful place. We could entice people to come here. And essentially, he sort of envisioned what became modern tourism in Hawaii, which when you really look at it, was sort of the template for modern tourism everywhere in the world. But what made it fascinating was his decision was we could use surfing to do this. Surfing could be one of the prime elements that we use to promote Hawaii as a tourist destination. The couple fascinating things here. One of the fascinating things about surfing is when you look at the standard stereotype images that they have used to promote Hawaii for the last 100 years or so. The ukulele came from Portugal. I think originally it came from Madeira, I think. Okay, it came from Portugal. Grass skirts came from the South Pacific island of Yap. Okay, pineapples came from Southeast Asia and the Philippines. The only truly indigenous Hawaiian image or Hawaiian activity or iconic Hawaiian, image that they have used to promote tourism is surfing. It's the only one. And Alexander Hume Ford, I guess, grasped this. And so they started promoting Waikiki. Look how closely that picture on the cover of a 1929 issue of Vogue magazine. Look how well it approximates Ivanka Trump and Raimana. But so yeah, they were using it to promote tourism, and it may have stayed this way for decades. Next image, please. This is really interesting. I found this cell doing some research. I found this cell. This predates Disney movies. This predates the Mickey Mouse, show. Even long before that, Mickey was getting it on out there in his canoe, surfing Waikiki with Goofy and Minnie. I just love that image. But see, this would have been surfing. This might have been what surfing was considered by the rest of the world, had not, in the early 1930s, a young swimming champion from Wisconsin moved to Hawaii, become completely enamored with surfing, and he changed the entire direction of the sport. Tom Blake, as I mentioned, he was a young swimming champion from Wisconsin. He saw news footage of Duke Kahanamoku, the famous Hawaiian Olympic swimming champion and proto-surfer who they call the father of modern surfing. He saw newsreels of him. He said, I got to learn how to surf. He lived in Wisconsin. So he made it to California. He was a lifeguard, got a job at a beach club, met the Duke. Duke told him all about Hawaii. And Tom Blake moved to Hawaii and completely immersed himself in surfing. But the big difference was that surfing in Hawaii, and if you want to talk about Hawaiian surfing culture, surfing in Hawaii was just an intrinsic part of what being a Hawaiian meant. Hawaiians surfed the way they threw net, the way they fished, the way they dove, the way they paddled canoe, the way they danced, the way they sang. It was all part of this intrinsic Hawaiian culture. But when Tom Blake showed up, he became so enamored with the sport, and he was from Wisconsin. That's all he wanted to do. That he wanted to become, and I challenge any academic to have a debate with me about this. He became the first modern surfer, somebody that would actually call himself a surfer. And he completely immersed himself in the sport in ways that not even the Hawaiians did. I mean, he started researching board design. He would go to the Bishop Museum and get permission to measure and examine the only existing boards from the 17th century that still existed. He started experimenting with making boards lighter, hollow, easier to surf, techniques of surfing. He completely immersed himself in it. But what he did at the same time is he completely immersed himself in a lifestyle that was completely new then, but when you read a little bit about how he described it, in the first book that was ever published about surfing, published by Tom Blake, Hawaiian Surf Riders, 1935, you read a description, all sorts of things about ancient Hawaii, legends that he learned, board design. He talks about it all. But the part that really establishes him at what I call the first modern surfer is this part here that he writes. And it's not too long, but I just want you to listen to this and think about, this was written in the early 1930s. And think about how prescient this passage is in how it shaped how we, the surf culture today, perceives themselves. He writes, acquaintances in the States have asked me why I bury myself on the Hawaiian Islands. The reason is because I like it. It fits my nature. It is life's compensation for a nature as mine. I like it because I can live simple and quietly here. I can live well without a social life. I can dress as I please. For comfort, usually it's a pair of canvas sneakers, light trousers and a sleeveless polo shirt, or maybe with swimming trunks all day. I like the islands because I can keep 100% tan here year-round, rest and sleep for hours in the wonderful sunshine each day. I like it because of the natural beauty of everything here. The very blue sky, the very white clouds, very green mountains clothed in foliage to their ridges. the cocoa palms waving in the clean trade winds, the colors of the water on the coral reef. All of this greets my eyes each day as I near the beach. And when the giant waves of the Kahalawehuehi surf are breaking white far from shore, it means royal sport is waiting. And I actually break into a run to get my surf trunks and get out my favorite surfboard. He's describing what later became a modern surfer's life, when you really think about it. Because what he was describing in here was a life designed specifically about being ready to surf whenever the surf was good. And if you had to eschew some of the other aspects of society, like a social life, like a job, basically, for him, he was willing to do that to be able to be there when the surf is good. And he established, that template. Now, at about the same time, other surfers from California, from the nascent surf scene there, they started traveling to Hawaii, and they basically saw what was going on, and they brought that back to California. And you can see that easily in some of these earlier images. They're having a luau at San Onofre. You see the thatched huts. You see everybody surfing together. They brought a lot of what Tom Blake, that sort of hybrid culture, they brought it back to California. Now, people were surfing elsewhere in the 40s and 50s, but just tiny, tiny little pockets of people. There wasn't enough people to actually establish what you might want to call a culture. But you can see how, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, a lot of what Tom Blake was talking about, San Onofre especially, these people bought into it heart and soul. They built their lives around being able to park their cars on the beach, lay on the beach, surf, have a luau. Look over to the far right, a baby in a crib with an umbrella. This was beach culture, but in a completely different way than beach culture like at Biarritz, or Rio de Janeiro. This was surfing beach culture. And you can see that the experience was a collective experience in a way. It was a collective experience. These people, look at the joy expressed in this image. The joy of thinking we live in a place, in a way, in a time, in a fashion, when we can all be there together in a group with no shirts on. Like, imagine in the same period, the mid-1950s, a picture of this many people gathered together like that, playing music, guitar. There's some legendary surfers there. There's the woman there working the radio who's super stylish. I don't know who she is. But surfing at the time, and this beach culture that I'm talking about, it was a collective thing. We all did it together. So along with Hawaiian Surf Riders 1935, and along with Tom Blake, who really was like the first big instigator of what we'll eventually talk about surf culture, the next big point, the next big jumping off point was the very first issue, the publishing. I jumped ahead of myself here. So this was beach culture. It was a collective thing. It was counterculture in that, like Tom Blake described, you're not walking the same path as everybody else going to work. And then this happened. The movie Gidget. A lot of people might know about Gidget or have heard of Gidget. The book came out 2 years earlier. The movie came out. And basically the plot was, and it's based on a real person, Kathy Koner. She was a young 16-year-old girl from Pacific Palisades. She would go stay at a friend's beach house on the beach in Malibu, and she'd see this little nascent surf scene, and she went, God, that looks so great. That looks so cool. I want to be a part of that. And so she eventually worked her way into the scene and met some of the guys and some of the women. You don't see any of them in the movie, and she goes, look, I want to be a surfer. Why should it just be these lucky people? Yeah, I live in Pacific Palisades. Yeah, I go to a Catholic school, but I want to be like them. And so they made the movie Gidget, and it was a revelation to the world that it was the first introduction to this bohemian California surf culture. And as you can see, it was actually authentic. There's the shack at Malibu. There's Gidge, hanging out with her balsa board. Over to the right there, who knows, there's probably Tube Steak Tracy there. It was an actual culture. But except for Gidget, the rest of the world might not have even heard about this, that it was even happening, who knows, maybe for decades. But there was one scene in particular in the movie Gidget. Could you go back to the previous? There was one scene in particular. The protagonists are the Kahuna and Moondoggie, and there's Gidget. And in the movie, the ridiculous plot, which changed from the book, was that she didn't know who she wanted to lose her virginity to. The young, handsome Moondoggie or the older, more masculine, virile Kahuna. That's basically the plot of the movie. The book was different. But there's this scene in the movie that is amazingly prescient, as I said, I've used that word before, in how it affected the perception of what being a surfer was. And in that scene, Gidget is in the shack that I showed you before. Kahuna's there. She's talking to Kahuna. She's getting to meet the great man. And she asks him, well, what does he do? And he says, what do you mean, what do I do? And she goes, well, don't you work or go to school or anything? And he goes, no. And she goes, you don't mean that you're a, and he goes, yeah, a surf bum. He goes, ride the waves, eat, sleep, not a care in the world. Gidget is horrified. When this movie came out, there might have been 150 surfers on the coast of California. Came out in 1959. By the summer of 1960, there were probably 500 surfers. It's the biggest boom until, as Nick described, the COVID boom. Suddenly, everyone wanted to surf pretty much because of Gidget, and everyone wanted to surf the way they did in California. But the people that had been surfing since the 50s and up into the 60s, to them, this was a disaster. To them, Gidget was Ivanka Trump. That was the death knell of surf culture. But here's what the fascinating thing is I'll explain in just a couple minutes. The irony of all this is that speech that Kahuna gave in the shack to Gidget really does describe the way that surfers wanted to feel about themselves for the next 40 years. And even though Gidget was derided as corny and phony and horrible, no, when you go back and watch it with a mind for history, you realize, no, that scene, let alone they had great footage of Mickey Dora and Mickey Munoz doubling for Moondoggie and Gidget at a place called Leo Carrillo, and Mickey Munoz was so short, they put him in a bikini and a wig, and he doubled for Gidget. So there's great stuff in the movie if you ever get a chance to watch it. But that scene was, even though the whole movie was, like I said, it was derided as phony, it's death to surf culture, that scene in the shack there really was quite influential. The next big sort of stepping off point in terms of when surf culture took a huge jump happened the very next year in 1960. And that was the publishing of the very first issue of Surfer magazine. Now, at the time, John Severson was a surf filmmaker. He was making films throughout the mid-50s. Those movies were very popular, in vets' halls and school auditoriums. And he came up with an idea. He thought, hey, a lot of these surfers are gathering here. They're desperate for imagery. I might publish or print a program, and I'll sell these programs at these surf films so that people can take images of the movie home. And as you see, like I said, once again, you can come up and look. It's filled with images from the movie. And in the first issue of Surfer, which is actually a fascinating document because not only is it images from the movie, but it actually is the first it sort of collated the surfing mentality and the surfing ethic into something you could hold in your hand. And there were images and there were some ads. There was even some fiction. Think about this. Can you imagine doing this today? A map of all the surf spots in Southern California. You want to know where to go? Here we go. Some of the most localized spots in the 70s and 80s. No, they list them all. Hollywood by the Sea, Point Dume, they've got it all. And even talk about inclusive, even imagery of women surfing in the very first issue of Surfer. This is Linda Benson, the little girl that stole the show, was 15 years old. She won the Makaha International Surf Championship. At the time, that was the sports world title. So they even had women in the first issue. They had people. The basic message was people are having fun doing this. And they're doing it together. I mean, look at all the images of surfers riding together, you know. People are having fun. It was sort of yes, they were going to the North Shore and they were challenging those big waves. But even that was sort of depicted as this sort of just adventurous, exciting, fun thing, not this epic quest. There's even a shot of 3 people riding on the same board. Mickey Munoz, Mickey Dora, and Mike Doyle riding on the same board. I mean, it just depicted surfing as something that was fun, it was new, it was counterculture, it was exciting, and it was something we all did together. And then, inexplicably, and I wished I'd got the chance to ever ask John Severson why he did this. He took the message of his entire magazine and he flipped it on its head on the very last page. 2 ahead, 1 more. On the very last page, this is one of surfing's, after Tom Blake, this is surfing's most powerful, impactful manifestos. And John Severson wrote, in this crowded world, the surfer can still seek and find the perfect day, the perfect wave, and be alone with the surf in his thoughts. And there's a picture of Rennie Yater, Santa Barbara, paddling out on a cold winter day at Hammond's Reef in Santa Barbara. The rest of the surfer, called the surfer, as I said, it depicted a culture that we were all doing together. And then suddenly, with this single image and that single manifesto, he created this ideal, that the ideal experience of surfing was to experience it alone. The effect of this wouldn't be felt for a few years. It was that stone dropped into the puddle. But that single manifesto there would eventually change what we perceive as surf culture. Next image there. First, we had to get through the longboard era. It's amazing how a lot of surfers of a certain age, and even young surfers, they talk about the longboard era. And it was this period that sort of is looked back nostalgically, sometimes with a little, like an innocent time, and it was a fun time. And you know, it was looked at this very influential, impactful era in surfing. Well, it was all those things, but it wasn't an era. The longboard period, the longboard blip on surfing's historical timeline, which I am saying started in 1960 when boards began being mass-produced out of polyurethane foam. The whole longboard era lasted 7 years. It lasted from 1960 to 1967. That whole thing, the Beach Boys, the Woodies, the Hanging Ten, you know, the big boards, all of it. It was a blip on the timeline. It was 7 years. And what happened 7 years later was the advent and what they called the shortboard revolution. Oh, wait. Oh, I didn't. These things had dropped out. During that time, being that sort of sold to the world as this sunny, tan, sexy, wholesome sport, competitive surfing developed. And competitive surfing, suddenly, surfing in the longboard period was also considered a sport. You know, before it was more of a lifestyle. But now it's considered a sport. And you can see, I mean, covered on ABC's Wide World of Sports, you know, the U.S. Open of surfing is nothing new. You know, I mean, surfers saw that there was no sort of difference between being like a lifestyle surfer and being a competitive surfer. For example, the great Barry Kanapuni, seen here at Malibu during a Malibu contest, and then in Hawaii, of course, he was a legendary big wave rider, and but to surf competitively, that it was that era where surfing, sort of that brief period where surfing was considered a sport. And it's where the whole idea of surfing as a sport developed. All that changed radically, and I'm using that word again, not getting back to its origin, I'm using it in the surfing way, is it all changed in 1967 with the development of the shortboard. I could do a whole speech about the history of the shortboard, but just to make it easy, was that as surfing developed, surfers started, they had a quest for more performance on a wave in different parts of the wave. They wanted to turn more severely and more sharply. They wanted to ride in places on the wave they couldn't on the big, long longboards. And so they started cutting the boards down. Surfers like Bob McTavish, influenced by an American kneeboarder named George Greeno, and working with the great Nat Young and Dick Brewer in Hawaii. And they started shortening the boards and cutting them down and cutting them down. And what that meant was that surfers could achieve much greater maneuverability on a wave, and suddenly they could start surfing at right angles. They didn't have to go primarily in one direction with long, slow turns. They could do very acute, radical changes of direction. And as the shortboard developed for the next few years, here's a perfect example of one of those radical changes of direction that was a result of the shortboard. This is the great Mike Purpose surfing Rocky Point in the early 70s. The interesting thing about that maneuver, and I'm going to digress just a few minutes as briefly as I can. In the late 1950s, in the Malibu scene, there were a lot of girls that wanted to surf with their boyfriends, but the boards were so big and heavy. Well, a number of talented surfboard designers at the time, primarily a guy named Matt Kivlin and Joe Quigg, they said, well, let's make the boards smaller and narrower and lighter and easier for the gals to carry. You know, those poor weak women, you know, let's make shorter boards. So they did, and the girls flourished in Malibu. There were some really good, competent surfers at Malibu. Well, one day, a surfer named Les Williams, in the, let's say 56, 57 maybe, said, hey, you know, these boards are kind of, I want to try one of these boards. He paddled out on like Vicky Flaxman's board, and he started carving the board up and down on the wave and the perfect Malibu wall. And at one point, he did such a radical change of direction that he came all the way back to where the whitewater was, and then he rebounded and went back the other direction. He did the world's first cutback, like actual cutback. I met Les Williams when he was in his 80s, and I was introduced to him, and I said, I'm so happy to meet you, Mr. Williams. You're the man that ruined surfing. He goes, what do you mean? I go, you invented the cutback. I go, before you'd see all your friends riding together at Malibu. You'd ride three stacked up, racing each other. Once you developed the cutback, you needed that wave all to yourself. You needed all that room, and suddenly, overnight, surfers there was the concept was introduced. It took a while to develop, but there was the concept of my wave, which is one of the craziest things you could ever think about. How can that be your wave? But anyway, I digress here. But this is what started happening, where surfers started having a more, I'd say, involved, intimate relationship with the wave. And that completely changed the perspective of what being a surfer was. Suddenly, it wasn't about the fun. It wasn't about fun in the sun. It wasn't even about surfing the sport, you know, with being filmed at the Huntington Pier wearing a helmet. Suddenly, it was about an intimate relationship with Mother Nature and Mother Ocean. It was about riding in a wave to where the surfer, it was a dance. It was an art form. You know, they had all sorts of different names for the riding in the tube. They called it the Green Room, the Crystal Cathedral. You know, on the shortboard, surfing took on a psychedelic sort of taste, a little tone. But the essence of it was that the ideal surfing situation, just like John Severson wrote, you know, 10 years earlier, to have the ideal situation, you rode alone and you rode on a perfect wave. Now, whoever defined what a perfect wave was, that was the surf media. And I'm going to take full blame for a lot of that because of all the years I worked in the surf media. But this was a period from about 1970 to about 1976 where surfing, for the only time really in its history, modern history, was what I call a monoculture. Starting in about 1970, when surfing became this art form, when surfing became this solo endeavor, when it was all about merging with the ocean and dancing with the sea, and then mixing that with the high performance capabilities of the shortboard, it became an individual expression. The irony was everyone dressed the same. They all had the same hair. They rode the same boards. They dreamed the same dreams. They wanted the same things. It was really one of the only times that surfing had a monoculture. And it existed only up to about 1970, reluctantly into 1976, 77. What changed then was the advent of modern professional competitive surfing. And what changed the sport was that's what the media started to focus on. They started to focus on competitive surfing. And at the time that meant Hawaii, and it meant big waves, and it meant hollow waves, and it meant giant waves. And the sort of self-expression of your average surfer just doing what he wants to do at home in his average beach break, that disappeared from the surf media. It created this ideal. But for that short period of time, surfing was a monoculture. I mean, look at Greg Lohr and Mike Purpose, like two great surfers. You couldn't tell them apart. You know, they looked alike, they surfed alike. So we had that monoculture existed. But like I said, at the same time, surfing became this spiritual pursuit. It was more of a spiritual pursuit. And the ideal is almost solo. He had his trusty dog. But, you know, that ideal, which actually motivated the actual participants in surfing, it actually was how the media for those same years, how they presented the sport. Now, the next sort of element that they took on that's just fed right into John Severson's manifesto of 1960 was suddenly the ideal of surfing was to find a perfect wave and to surf it alone. And what that meant pretty much for the rest of the world except for Hawaii, California, the eastern coast of Australia, Brazil, maybe Rio de Janeiro, a little bit in France, what it meant was traveling to some exotic fantasy place, finding a perfect wave, and surfing it all alone. Once again, an ideal that was completely unrealistic, out of the range of most average surfers and their experiences. But it was basically sold that way to where, you know, the ideal of the perfect wave, and it was established as a hollow wave, you know, very hollow wave, breaking either right, but strangely enough, primarily lefts. When you think about it, the perfect wave suddenly became a powerful, big, hollow wave. If you go back and watch The Endless Summer, it was called Search for the Perfect Wave. They found it at Cape St. Francis. It was about this big, and it was a real fun little point break. As time went on, the perfect wave became Pipeline. You know, then it became, Tamarin Bay on Mauritius. Then eventually it became Tahiti, and eventually it became Fiji, and eventually it became G-Land. You pick your, and then the Mentawai just blew the whole perfect wave thing up. But suddenly that became the ideal of what the perfect wave was. The interesting thing about this was that, and how much time do I have? I know I'm going on. I got to quit now?
As much as you want.
Yeah, let me go a little bit longer because I'm just getting to the good part. So here's the interesting thing about this. Was that period that I'm talking about from roughly 70 to let's say 76. When surfers today talk about surf culture, when they think about what authentic surf culture was, they're always thinking about what it was. They rarely think about what it is. They think about what it was. And if you talk to, and if you guys, I think a number of you are really honest with yourselves, the era that you're pointing back to of when surf culture was authentic, it was this period. It was a tiny little period in the sport where surfing had a monoculture, where we always sort of felt that we were doing it for the same reasons. We were doing it for the right reasons. You know, we were riding the same boards. We were dressed the same way. I know guys that are in their 20s that talk about, oh, surf culture's dead. I mean, you know, it's not like it was back then. And I'm going, back when? You're talking about 45, 50 years ago. I mean, you know, what about everything that's come after that? This is what most people point to when they talk about the decline in surf culture. They think this period somehow, because I'll tell you what, starting in 77, 76, 77, 78, and through then, as pro surfing developed and as pro surfing dominated the media, nobody looks back at that and goes, oh yeah, that was authentic surf culture. I remember those days. Those are the great days. Nobody says that, you know? And then what came after that, you know, the development of the surfwear industry, the huge expansion of the surfwear industry and professional surfing booming and sponsored surfing. Nobody looks back at, you know, the 80s and 90s, you know, Echo Beach and, you know, Dayglow and Quicksilver and all the brands. Nobody looks back at that and says, yeah, that was it. That was the time. They hearken way back to this period. Well, the interesting thing was that even surfers that do that, they're looking at a tiny little period of surfing history. Even if you measure it from 1900 to 1980, that's a tiny little period of surfing history. The interesting thing that was happening during that period, I'm telling you, it's like 76, 77 and on. While the surf media, and once again, I'll take all the slings and arrows because I participated in that, was that it was presenting this idealized image of surfing that was very real and very authentic, but for a tiny, tiny percentages of the surfers in the world. The surfers that could ride giant big waves, the surfers that were towing into giant piahi, the surfers that were winning the world titles, that were traveling and getting sponsored and going to these exotic places, they represented a tiny, minuscule percentage of surfers in the world and a tiny percentage of what was actually happening in surfing. And the way that I like to see it is that during that time, surfing knew what it wanted. It knew what it wanted to do. It knew what it wanted to be. The only thing was, it had to do it all by itself because the existing surfing media, they didn't want anything to do with surfing. They were focused on their perception and their presentation of surfing. So I'll run through it quicker than I would have ordinarily. But look at what happened at the same time, developing during that period underneath the idealized image of surfing that we got in the media. Think about this. Only 7 years spread, only 7 years separated from a longboard on Surfer Magazine's cover to a longboard on Surfer Magazine's cover, or 7.5 years. That's all. Longboards were already coming back only 6 or 7 years after they went away. Surfing was telling us something. It was telling us, you know what? Some of us just want to go out and surf and have fun. I want to go out and surf, Côte de Basque. I want to go out and surf Porto. I'm not going to G-Land, So longboards started to develop. Oh, once again, just the picture of, such a beautiful picture of self-expression in 1972. This is the ideal of surfing. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. One of the big problems was, of course, it wasn't that great a time because there were all these other guys out there just like you that were looking for that intimate relationship with the ocean. I have to speed by all this stuff. Of course, one of the bad sides of that was the delusion of thinking that you were supposed to be surfing alone, as John Severson told us. It led to the rise of localism, which was the great cancer in surf culture. Locals only. So you get back to, like I said, during that same time, as the longboard started to reassert itself. You even had great champions like David Nueva saying, hey, wait a minute, I'm older now, but I'm still a really talented surfer. I can ride a longboard. It didn't take long when they call it the modern longboard era, it didn't take long till longboard blanks started equaling the number of shortboard blanks, and for a while, they actually exceeded them. So you had longboarding started to come back. Bodyboarding, the original form of surfing, from the shores of West Africa to ancient Marquesas to Hawaii in the early days, riding on your stomach on a pipe-a-board is the original form of surfing. Think about the names, spongers, boogers, all the derisive names that have been laid onto bodyboarders when they are the purest of all surfers. They're surfing the way that our Polynesian progenitors first surfed. But not only that, it was also incredibly fun, just like those kids. Think about the kids like in Tahiti and the river mouth at Papa Nui surfing on their pipe-a-boards, or West African kids in Angola riding their little tambua belly boards on the beach. There they are now. As the bodyboard started to develop in popularity, it became the most widely surfed craft on earth. You would have no idea that was happening in the mainstream surf media. I actually was the senior editor of Bodyboarding Magazine. I think our magazine lasted 3 years. Then it was gone. So all of this was happening as surfing sort of, I'm not going to say self-corrected because it doesn't mean that what was going on was invalid. It was just this tiny little portion. Surfing had other ideas of what it wanted. And Nick went into this wonderfully. The resurgence of women in the lineup. If you look at those passages or think about those passages that I read to you, all of them say the same thing. Surfers of both sexes surfing together. They all surf together. They surfed to the beach and made love. I mean, come on. Think how that would really spice up your go out next time. Now, it wasn't easy for them. It was a challenge. And once I said, Nick, articulated that beautifully, how they were met with resistance, but they didn't stop. And women's surfing started to reassert itself over these decades I'm talking about. And they started reasserting themselves in wonderful ways, not just in participating, but also working their way in and earning respect as top surfers, as competitors, as the many-time world champion Lisa Anderson. But it wasn't just in contest as time went on. There were new forms of surfing being developed. The stand-up paddleboard. Thank you, Laird Hamilton, who also gave us the tow-in board, who also gave us the foil board. So you had someone like Laird Hamilton, who the primary magazines, they ignored him primarily. Meanwhile, during this whole period, he's innovating fascinating new ways to surf during this whole time. The wave pool, suddenly the wave pool. I mean, the very first surfer magazine I saw was the March issue of 1967. It's when I moved to Hawaii. In that issue, the March issue, there's an article about a wave pool. It was in Japan. It was in a shopping center. It was called the Surfatorium. Big Surf opened in Tempe, Arizona in 1968. And it's still a pretty fun wave if you'd surf it today. It was featured in 2 prominent surf movies in the 60s, Sunshine Sea and Cosmic Children. So wave pools are nothing new. But the reemergence of it and the whole idea of bringing surfing away from the ocean and providing it for other people, once again, that sort of ethic that was sort of growing underneath what you would normally see or perceive as surf culture. One of the other great things that happened was young surfers deciding, hey, you know what? I want to ride longboards. I don't need to be a competitive pro surfer in the standard way. I want to enjoy that thrill that my parents felt, And so the resurgence of young longboarding, which I think is a wonderful thing, it's a graceful form of surfing. It's a lot about fun. And also it's really inclusive of female surfers who have really exceeded and excelled in that sport. So you have the new longboarding that has been developing. And not just on longboards at 3-foot Malibu, but you got young ladies charging, epic barrels at Padang Padang. Women have been liberated emotionally, and psychologically they've been liberated. We asked the question, all the years I worked in the magazine, why has there never been a single photo of a female surfer riding an outside Second Reef pipeline wave? Why not? They're completely capable. I mean, Lane Beachley is bigger and stronger than Michael Ho. It's not a physical thing. They were being held back psychologically by the male-dominated sport. One of the most wonderful things about surfing today is and once again, as Nick talked about, that's been broken down. I mean, 15 years old, Aaron Brooks got in the final of the Padang Padang Cup against the men in Padang in Indonesia. Just a perfect example of surf culture today. Like I said, completely new ways to surf. Laird Hamilton adapted a water skiing foil to the surfboard. In doing so, he invented the first new way to surf in 3,000 years. Since time immemorial, we've been riding planing hulls on the wave, and he developed a way to ride and focus on the energy underneath in the skin of the wave. But whole new ways to surf that aren't looked down on now, as they might have in the past, like boogie boarders, like longboarders, who were looked down when they wanted to ride something different. The next image to me, and I'm almost finished here, this to me completely represents in one single image today's surf culture. You've got Kai Lenny doing something on a wave that no one could ever imagine. And you have a young girl surfer there, completely competent, you can tell by her style, and her mind is blown by it. But they're doing it together on the same wave. Think about it. Surf culture today has room for both of these surfers, not just out there in the world. They've got room for them on the same wave. So here's what I'm getting at, and here's sort of the focus of the whole thing for me. And it brings me back to to Porto, and it brings me back to this event and the surf school competition and the whole aspect of all this is when you really think about it, culture isn't something that happened. It's not something that was. It's something that is. Surfing is telling us that surf schools are surf culture. That's how surf culture has developed. You know, all the different forms of surfing, the different boards, the different applications, whether you're surfing 70-foot Nazare or if you're surfing 2-foot Porto, you know, whether you're a grizzled old timer or like a young Grom that's really stoked. Every wave that anyone rides could be described, the aspect, the act of it could be described as it was the very first time that a European wrote a description of surfing. And that was in Captain Cook's Voyages. And the book came out in 1779. It actually wasn't written by Cook, it was written by a lieutenant who was watching a surfer in Tahiti riding waves at Matavai Bay. They couldn't understand at first what he was doing because he would ride a wave and he was surfing in a canoe. He wasn't even surfing on a surfboard. He would ride the wave in and to their surprise would paddle back out, take another wave, paddle back out, take another wave. When it finally occurred to them that, wait, they're just doing that for fun. They're just having fun out there. He wrote the greatest description of surfing that I personally feel has ever been written. Nick and myself and Jibus and, you know, we've been writing so many words about surfing in our careers. We have never written anything so beautiful that when Lieutenant King wrote about that image, he wrapped it up by saying, you could go to the next one if you want, just to bring us back to ancient Hawaii. He wrapped up his image, he said, I could not help but conclude that the man must have felt the most supreme pleasure being driven on so fast and smoothly by the sea. Think about that. That's the first description of surfing. And aren't we all? Aren't we all? Thank you for listening.